G'day guys, my name is CJ. This is the Blackview BV8100 and this phone is pretty ridiculous. Let's take a look. Smartphones are ubiquitous in 2024. Everyone has one, and across the board, there's not a lot that separates one from the other. Performance, design, cameras, and even battery life are typically comparable from mid-range all the way up to flagship. So when Blackview came along and showed me the BV8100 phone, I was pretty intrigued. So what we've got here at its core is a mid-range Android smartphone made by a largely unknown OEM called Blackview, which seems to operate out of China and Hong Kong. Now the BV8100 is an absolute beast of a phone, literally. It is absolutely massive and is basically the love child of a standard mid-range Android phone with an OtterBox phone case. It is thick, it is angles and rubber galore, and unsurprisingly feels really solid in the hand. It gives off super rugged tank vibes like the Nokia 3310, but what really caught my eye about this phone though is that it contains a whopping 8800 mAh battery inside. Yes, you heard me right, 8800 milliamps. Now combine that with a MediaTek Helio G99 mid-range chip, and that's a recipe for a phone that could maybe last as long as a Nokia 3310. But first, let's go back to the design because there's some really interesting things going on here. So again, it's a super thick device with rubber accents all over the place, sandwiching an aluminium frame. And all of this is to protect the phone from the elements, which you can see from all the screws that you can see all around the phone, all the way down to the USB-C flap, to the manually extracted SIM card slot, and it's nailed it with ratings to be IP68, IP69K, and military grade standard resistance. So it's waterproof, dustproof, shockproof, and so rugged in most cases until you get to things like the power button. Now to its credit, it does double up as a fingerprint sensor, but the button seems to be held on by just simply a tiny string or something like that because it feels quite flimsy and makes this weird sort of flimsy, loose sort of sound. Something that I struggle to get my head around given how rugged this phone otherwise is. Now, interesting, there's also a shortcut button on the other side that you can see in the device, and you can customize how it works in software. And one of these functions is to load the app that turns on the flashlight module on the top of the phone, a feature that I've never really seen before. And on the back, you've got a little ringlet attachment that you can connect lanyards and other straps to. Plus, it's got design details that just scream rugged and outdoorsy vibes, and honestly, I think that's the audience that it's targeting. Now, speaking of audience, if you enjoy the content I make, hitting the subscribe button would be incredible. It helps out this channel out massively. Anyway, on the front, you've got a screen that's a pretty standard affair, being a 6.5-inch 1080p 120Hz LCD display that goes up to 440 nits. So it's got a pretty fluid and smooth experience with just about okay outdoor visibility. You've also got a glove mode that increases the display sensitivity, so you can use it reliably outdoors in the really cold climates whilst wearing gloves. It's also got 8 gigs of RAM that can expand virtually to 24 gigs, and the SIM card slot, interestingly, also has microSD expansion all the way up to 1 terabyte. It can double up as a second SIM card slot too, making it a really cool throwback to the good old days of previous Android phones. And of course, as mentioned before, underneath you've got a little USB-C port under a flap that enables 45-watt charging, which it definitely needs given now how massive the battery is. Fortunately though, there is no wireless charging, and honestly it would have been quite impressive if they could have somehow have gotten that conduction through all of these thick rubber and plastic layers, but alas, it's not the case here. So on the outside, what you've ended up with is just a super rugged phone that feels like it'll cop the most physical of tasks. Excellent for the hiker or camper who tends to be out in the wilderness for long stints at a time, away from things like running water or electricity. And with a battery capacity of 8800 milliamps, you'd expect it to be able to keep up, right? So let's actually talk about using and living with the device. Now, I'll be honest, I'm not the most active or the biggest lover of hiking out there, but I was just interested to know how good the battery life was with such a large unit. Now, of course, by simple virtue of its size, we know it's going to last quite long and longer than conventional smartphones. And I'm not sure anyone is surprised, but when you combine it with a low-powered mid-range processor, this thing is going to last quite a while. So in a normal day, which included quite a decent amount of social media, YouTube streaming, audio streaming, casual gaming, the phone easily lasted all day, often getting to the end of the day with about 60 to 70% battery left. And honestly, with these numbers, I'd be getting around at least 12 to 14 hours of screen on time. And this certainly matches estimations given that modern phones with half the capacity, it's not unreasonable to get about 4 to 5 hours of screen on time. Now, of course, with more restrained use, it could even last longer than that. So I could imagine someone out camping, this easily lasting them a weekend out without being too concerned about battery life, seeing as how you'll probably be preoccupied with the outdoors. Now, of course, with more intense use like constant gaming, it's going to chew up battery life a lot quicker, but regardless of use, you're going to easily get at least 2 days, if not more, solid battery life. In fact, Blackview seemed to claim 883 hours of standby time, and I'm not that confident it'll last that long, but it still lasts an insane amount of time. And in another really interesting feature though, is that this phone can effectively act as an external power bank for other devices, given a 5-watt wireless charge through that USB-C port. So all in all, a pretty interesting package when it comes to the battery. Now in terms of overall phone performance, it runs Android 14 with its own software called Doke OS, which is effectively just a very vanilla version of Android with a few little unique options in settings that enable a little bit of customization, like what the shortcut button does, which includes a whole bunch of other utility apps such as a decibel meter, a measuring app, compass, things like that, useful tools for people who, like I said, are more of the outdoorsy inclination. Now, the overall experience is pretty standard Android affair, and there's really not a lot to say. If you've used an Android from recent years, it'll be a rather familiar experience. They really haven't done a lot to mess around with the experience, and you get most of Google's features, including Gemini, which is still pretty cool. Now, performance-wise, whilst the screen does do a lot to help make the phone feel really quick and smooth, you can still tell that it's a mid-range phone because every now and then you still see small stutters here and there, even from just simply scrolling around the UI. Now, I'm sure a lot of this has got to do with software optimization, but it is pretty noticeable when it happens. And on top of that, the overall experience is decidedly mid-range as well. The haptics are really buzzy and weak, and there's only a single down-facing speaker, which gets decently loud, but it's still a single speaker setup in the end. So it'll never be quite as immersive as the next phone that has a stereo speaker setup. And to be honest, there's actually quite a few mid-range phones that have these stereo setups anyway, so it's pretty disappointing to see a single speaker here. And speaking of disappointing, the cameras here are just pretty standard. Now, as I've reiterated many times, cameras nowadays have progressed to a point where majority of phones will be able to take pretty good photos in daylight. And it's no different here. The BV8-100 has a dual speaker setup with a 50 megapixel standard wide and a 13 megapixel ultra wide lens with a 120-degree field of view. And in broad daylight, outdoor photos and videos are pretty good. There's a decent amount of detail, good color reproduction, and for the average punter, it'll probably be fine. In low light though, it does struggle quite a bit more, and often photos can look a little soft. Now, some of this is compensated for by the various night modes you can get, but in general, it's a pretty average setup. But again, this isn't really what this phone is made for. This is a rugged phone for the great outdoors, and it'll do great with outdoor daylight photos. If you need better low light performance, you're probably going to opt for a different phone anyway, or have your own dedicated camera for that purpose. Now, the front camera is a 32 megapixel fixed focus shooter, and again, it's a soft-ish unit, but it's passable. For the most part, it'll be mainly useful for video calls and the casual Insta story. Now, I'm just going to go out on a limb here and guess that for the target audience, this isn't exactly going to be the most important feature. Interestingly enough though, Blackview seemed to imply that it will work for underwater photography though, where the camera can be triggered with that shortcut button. Now, I personally haven't tried this out, but historically clicking buttons underwater have always been a bit of a recipe for disaster. But if this works, then this would be a pretty cool feature for the adventurer out there. And overall, This is the type of customer Blackview are trying to entice. The BV8-100 is a super rugged smartphone with unique features aimed at the adventurer out there. It'll cop being dropped, dragged, and put through the ringer, and it'll last the distance too. It's not the prettiest device out there, but it at least nails its intended use case. Now the phone starts at $499 Australian or $330 USD for the 8GB RAM model with 256 gigs of storage, so it's a pretty inexpensive device on the whole, and ultimately you need to decide if ruggedness or extreme longevity at the expense of a more premium experience or better cameras is important to you. If so, this phone is going to be a great option for you, but if not, well, there's tons of other phones to choose from. But I want to know what you think. Is there a use case for a phone like this? Let me know why or why not in the comments section below. And if you enjoyed the video, give us a like, subscribe for more, and ding the bell icon so you don't miss out. Thanks again for watching, stay safe out there, and I'll catch you in the next one. Cheers.